Good evening. A return to democracy or an insult to Canterbury ratepayers? The government has announced a mixed model when it comes to representation for ECAN. Tonight we'll get analysis and reaction on this, and Lynched starts right now. Good evening. We'll get reaction to the government's decision to partially return democracy to ECAN shortly, but first, this week's memo to Christchurch. Well, you can't help but notice exciting developments in this city lately. As a News Talk ZB host, it is easy to get overwhelmed by the daily grind of negativity. After all, humans tend to react stronger to negative news. It's just how it is. And yes, we're living in a city with housing issues, and yes, the roads are bloody awful at times, but what's wrong with indulging in a little good news? Well, there are wonderful investment opportunities here, and there's wonderful investment being made right here in this city. Developers of the $25 million adventure park on the Port Hills will start construction for this year. Canadian company Select Evolution will build the park on 358 hectares of land between Dyers Pass, Worsleys and Summit Roads. Now, I'm not much of a mountain biker, but I am getting excited about this, and I know many adventure sports enthusiasts who just can't wait. The Christchurch Adventure Park, as it will be known, will be a world-first purpose-built year-round chairlift access downhill mountain bike park. Great news. Another major boost for the city has been unveiled. Now, the plans for this large private development in central Christchurch. Now, we're talking about the $140 million crossing development, a world-class retail precinct expected to be completed within 20 months. Now, developer Philip Carter says the crossing is good news for other investors considering opportunities in the central city and wanting reassurance that significant progress is being made in the CBD. He's right. We've been wanting confidence, haven't we, from other developers, and why would they want to take the plunge and risk all their money in Christchurch without knowing what's going there first? But wait, there's more, as Suzanne Paul would say. Eastern suburbs have something to smile about too. They do. Councillors agreed to proceed at least with the design for the Eastern Recreation Sports Centre that'll be located at QE2 Park along with Avonside Girls and Shirley Boys High School. So these things are good news, and yes, I do acknowledge the housing and road issues that continue to plague our city, but it is a chicken and egg situation. I've chosen to get excited about developments I generally wouldn't give two hoots about. Why? It's good for my mental health, and there's nothing wrong about getting a little excited about seeing our struggling city starting to take some shape. And that's this week's memo to Christchurch. Now on to other matters. Environment Canterbury. NBR reporter Chris Hutching has been taking a close look at developments on this, a partial return to democracy, and he joins me in the studio now. Good evening to you. Is it a partial return to democracy? Is it a return to democracy at all?
Well, I don't think so. We hear from Nick Smith the usual mantra that ECAN was dysfunctional before he appointed these commissioners. That flies in the face of a report that he got done by one of his own mates, Wyatt Creech, who's an ex-National MP. At that time in 2010, when he sacked the councillors, Wyatt Creech came out with this report saying ECAN is not dysfunctional. And he said that the debates around the table were the normal kind of thing that you'd have in any democratic institution.
Well, he's been very quiet about this, hasn't he? Now,
I think he's got a tiger by the tail. I think actually ECAN is probably more dysfunctional now than it has ever been. The experiment, in my view, has been quite a failure. It's divided the community, and the rural community in particular, especially in North Canterbury, around the Huronuri area.
I want to stop you there. That's a pretty powerful statement to make. It's been nothing more than a failure. Others would say the commissioners have actually managed to get on with the job more so than what other councillors at the time would say. Your response to that?
Well, what job? The Canterbury Water Management Strategy is not their invention. It was underway a long time before they turned up. The Land and Water Plan was well underway before they turned up. That's
interesting because we had Sir Kerry Burke on CTV News last week, and he was saying that Nick Smith is wrong. Nick Smith in his press release last week, or a couple of weeks ago now, said there was never a water plan. Sir Kerry Burke told me on CTV News, yes there was. So who's telling the truth?
Well, these things take years, you know, and it was always in the gestation. To say that there was no plan, I think what Nick's trying to say is that it hadn't been adopted and wasn't operative. But it was in the process of being formed, and to my mind, it's 2014 now. These commissioners turned up in 2010, so we're 4 years down the track. Have they been particularly speedier or better about it? And what have they achieved?
Have they in your mind?
Certainly not. And in terms of one of the most important areas that we're looking at up at Hurunui, which I mentioned before, this has been a massive failure. They came up with a plan which was going to allow dairy farmers in the inland reaches to put 25% more nutrients in the Hurunui River. And of course, a lot of people were, yippee, that's great, you know, Ngāi Tahu was up there with its dairy farms, of course. It was almost signed off. And at the last minute, this is a month or so back, the dryland farmers, the sheep farmers, said, hey, hang on, this isn't fair. We want to be able to pollute that river too. You can't give it to them. So now we're back to square one. And what sort of complicated arrangement you're going to get out of this, I do not know. But that is a major issue. It has not been resolved. And I think that the commissioners probably had a rude shock when they realised that things weren't going quite how they thought they were with this collaborative chitty-chatty system that they thought was underway.
All right, I still want to get back to a little bit of history here, if you could indulge me a little bit. In your view, Chris Hutching, the government sacked the councillors. Why?
It's all written down. It's in the Act, it's in the statements that Nick Smith has made, it's in the statement.
But do you buy that? Do you think, I mean, he would claim it was dysfunctional, there was too much infighting, they had no water management plan, it was a basket case, bye-bye. Fair comment or not?
Nonsense. There were several strands to it. One of them was that there were people that were lining up for water. They wanted water, especially in over-allocated areas. Another thing is quite simply political infighting. The district councils, which are mainly rural councils, don't like being told what to do. And that was a large part of it. Bob Parker was there as well. He had his own...
Bob Parker! What a blast from the past!
Bob is credited with being one of the leading lights in this whole situation coming about. Now, exactly what Bob's motivations were at the time, I really don't know. It might have been just a chance for this mayoral forum, which is just a group of mayors who get together and decide that they're going to call themselves a mayoral forum, to exercise their power. It's hard to say. But I don't think that there were any credible reasons for it, except that there was a water rush on, and the rural interests were not getting their water as quickly as they wanted.
So at the end of the day, this comes down to water.
Well, it does, and it's stated in the legislation which appoints the commissioners. It charges them with advancing water programs, and in his statement the other day where he said we're not going to return to a democracy, a large part of his statement was devoted to the water issue.
I want to come back to that later on, because I wonder whether this is a sign of things to come, and I almost mean that internationally. The arguments about water supply in New Zealand, that'll be quite a massive issue. It's not going to go away, is it?
No, I don't think it is. And sometimes I ask myself, what's it going to look like in 100 years' time or 200 years' time? What sort of place will we have? Will we still have rivers that run to the sea? I don't know. I think that, you know, we're getting to a point where we have to say, what are the limits on production?
Then, of course, farmers would argue, well, do you want an economy or not?
I guess, but you know, do you want all your eggs in one basket? We know about these arguments. Do you want everything to be directed towards milk production that's bought by China, one market? Yeah. You know, diversification, I'd say, is probably more the answer, and not just in the rural sector.
Well, I want to pick you up on diversification and what our economy should actually stand for shortly, but also still to come, can ECAN actually enforce rate increases with essentially no mandate? That's next. Welcome back. So ECAN has proposed increasing its rates for Canterbury residents, but does it actually have a mandate to do so with commissioners in place and not elected representatives? NBR reporter Chris Hutching is with us and he is my guest. So does it have a mandate to increase rates essentially without elected representatives?
Well, I don't really think it has, and also they haven't explained to us what this rates increase is all about. The inflation rate at the moment is 0.8%, that's below 1%. And they're proposing 5% rates increase. Well, what for?
So on top of this, so essentially all resident ratepayers of the city are looking at about a 13.5% increase on their rates, aren't they, with the council rates on top of that?
Yep, because ECAN, I think, it accounts for somewhere around about 10-ish% that's added on top of the city council rates. So what I would like to know is what programs are they undertaking that require this extra money? Is it the water program? I think it is, from my reading of the plan. Now, the public can make submissions, but are they going to take any notice of it? Because we know the way their meetings operate, everything's decided beforehand. There's no discussion. There are very few public representations. It's just, you know, the meeting's done, it's signed off, goodbye, we're off, on the plane, out of here.
Is that because they can do that though? Legally? Because there are commissioners in place, so there's no need for, well, I'm not saying there's not, but they would perhaps argue there's no need for public meetings because we're the bosses, we're in place, we got rid of the ones that couldn't do their jobs, this is how it is.
Well, they do have this kind of a farcical situation where they do have to keep up meetings, but they're not like the meetings of old where you'd find the reporters, say, down at the press would pop along down the road, a couple of blocks down the road, and they'd be able to report these things. Because now these meetings are held at places like Lincoln or Birmingham Drive. They're quite difficult to get to, and we don't see the reports anymore. We used to get reports on Environment Canterbury's activities every week in the press, 2 or 3 times sometimes. Now, they've just disappeared. So where are all these activities now? They're still happening, but they're not being reported. And I think they've made great efforts to keep Environment Canterbury below the radar, and sadly, most people are not really terribly interested in regional councils. They're a bit apathetic about these things, and they've been able to monopolise that.
I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but is that part of the reason? Has ECAN just given what the people want, and that's more of less? If that makes any sense at all.
I think to a degree, but you know, you could argue the same thing about school boards of trustees, district health boards, all of these institutions which are probably minority sports to a degree, but are we going to cancel them? Are we going to cancel them all? Are we going to reduce our democratic input?
Chris, do you worry that this mixed model representation will turn out to be similar to the way Sarah conducts its business with the council? Let's be honest about it. The Christchurch City councillors, well, I suppose now they've got a bit more power, but didn't really have much power to make decisions for the city. It was all to do with Sarah. Do you worry this will just be a mirror of that?
Well, of course, Chris, this is just so that the government can keep control, and they're determined to keep control, especially beyond this current election. Because I think that if they returned ECAN to democracy straight away, there would be a lot of mess that elected representatives would have to pick up and would become apparent to the public. So I think that...
Like what?
Well, the water management strategy for a start, which I think is a failure. The wood burner ban, I mean, what's all that about? We've lost about 20,000 houses in the earthquakes, probably 20,000 chimneys, maybe half that. So, you know, what's the big push?
Well, they would claim that they're just trying to keep up with best practice.
Well,
international best practice.
I think it might be a sort of a red herring to try and prove that we are environmental and we're going to hit you up with this. But there has been a report by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment who has dissed the way in which these things are measured, and particularly paying attention to Canterbury. She's talked about Canterbury's inversion layer and how people, you've got to trade it off with people being able to keep warm, for goodness sake, because there are ill health effects from that as well if you're in a cold place.
Well, that's very true too. I want to talk to you about the rates again, because I still can't understand how can this get the green light, because this will still have to go out to public so-called consultation, won't it? But you were saying before, though, that ECAN doesn't really do things in terms of public consultation because it doesn't have to. So therefore, how do we know that this will be meaningful consultation to increase their rates?
Well, we don't, and I think, you know, we've got every right to be cynical about that. I don't think that they will. I think they've got their program made up. I'll be fascinated to see if they take much notice of any of the submissions. I hope that local journalists will report on what those submissions are. They will be available for public perusal. You know, local press newspaper journalists can report on those and tell us what people are thinking. They can get a rundown of the number of people that are in favour of something or opposed to something. We can get a flavour of what those submissions are.
The Environment Canterbury's proposed work program that supports the council's long-term plan for the next 10 years, that's been released, yeah?
Yes.
And?
And
What do you reckon?
Well, you can go there.
Good reading, was it?
Yeah, great reading. It's a bit like the City Council's one too, you know, it's all about this thick. But
Get back to me with the notes, would you?
But you do have to go through it line by line, and you've got to work out just what sort of expenses, you know, where it's going.
Is there enough information there to say why there is the need for this increase of Environment Canterbury rates?
Well, I haven't figured it out, and I'm the kind of person that goes through these documents, you know, pretty thoroughly. And I would like some more explanation, and I don't know that we're going to get it though, because they're not in the habit of doing that, are they?
When it comes to this mixed representation, do you believe any of the so-called elected representatives will have any power at all? And if not, are we going to have trouble getting people back into ECAN again?
Well, they'll be very constrained because they're going to have these people who are appointees.
That's right.
It's still a feeding trough. And I wasn't going to get into this, but I had a look today at just how much these people are being paid, these commissioners. Now, Margaret Baisley's getting $220,312 a year. And then on Friday, she pops off back to Carterton where she does her gardening for the weekend before coming back to Canterbury on the Monday. Well, I would like to see Dame Margaret being given a lot more time to do gardening in Carterton. Now, David Cagle, for example, David Cagle gets $182,000. There's a judge, heaven help us, Skelton, he gets $116,000.
But you know, some would suggest you've got to pay them a good market rate to get them to do the job because they're best. They're the best of the best that can sort out ECAN.
Or you have to buy them off, because in the past there's an element of public service, and councillors in the past were getting roughly 50-odd thousand odd, maybe a few expenses here and there. So there was a strong element of public service to it. These people, they're doing it for the money.
I still want, who's the chap that was getting $2,000 a day to work at the council on its consent issues? I want Dud Martin's salary. He was getting $2,000 a day.
That's roughly equivalent, really.
I'm in the wrong job, that's for sure. $2,000 a day, hello. There's money, isn't there? And then there's Jenny Shipley, that seems to be on every board possible, but that's another story as well. Of course, NBR reporter Chris Hutching is with us. He is an expert commentator on the housing issues in this city. So we'll touch on the housing crisis in this city next. Well, we know it's tough going when it comes to the housing crisis. There have been some reports, for example, on the press saying there are more houses in Christchurch now, or just as many as pre-earthquake. I find that hard to believe. Chris Hutching, do you find that hard to believe?
Well, I find it very hard to believe. Perhaps they're talking about Greater Christchurch, maybe they're talking about Ashburton, Rangiora, Kaiport, but I don't think that we've had a replacement stock yet. I mean, we lost about 20,000 houses, 8,000 of those are red zoned. I don't think they've all been replaced within Christchurch.
I don't think so
and
either.
in any case, you'd be able to tell because of the prices. I mean, you know, supply demand is reflected in prices of rents and houses. It's still very high.
Well, has the government made a bit of a start? Because you've got another development being released last week, a couple of weeks ago now, 600 more houses near Riccarton Racecourse. Couldn't the argument be made, supply and demand, the more houses you flood the market with, even at the bottom end, those lower house prices will eventually have to come down. So isn't anything better than nothing?
It is. Possibly one of the odd problems we've got here is that we haven't got so much older stock, because a lot of those red zoned homes are older stock. So there's a lot of new stuff coming on.
So whether they're affordable or not.
Yeah, that's the issue.
That is the issue, because it's all very well for, I suppose, the government and other agencies to say, look, you know, come live in the central city, it's going to be great. But I'm yet to see any incentives for the developers to lower their prices. There is absolutely none. So so it's all very well to build, you know, Chinese boxes in downtown Christchurch, but they're still going to be very expensive Chinese boxes.
Well, they are, and you mentioned that development at Riccarton Racecourse. Well, I mean, that's not the inner city, is it? That's miles over the other side of the city. And, you know, if you've travelled there recently, you know how horrendous it is. But going back to the inner city, there will never be affordable housing there because the government has paid too much for the land to the people that bought property off. So they're not going to release it cheaply, and unless they do, I can't see that you can ever make housing affordable.
But doesn't the government have something to gain from releasing it cheaper? So then you have houses in Christchurch, that makes people happy, the voters go, yay!
Chris, it's relative, you see, because there'll be other people, other business guys there who have got land or who have bought land, and they won't want to see property values going down. So basically it's this sort of jiggery-pokery where you're trying to make sure that everybody keeps up there so that nobody gets disappointed. But it mitigates against first home buyers. Now, first home buyers are a small segment of the market. As soon as first home buyers get a home, they don't have the same interest anymore in having a cheap house because they've got a home and they'd like to see it increase in value. So it's a kind of a temporary wave, if you know what I mean, and trying to look after people on that bottom rung to help them get up there is an enormous challenge. I don't know quite how you do it. In the past, I think we all did it by buying second-hand old villas and doing them up, and that's kind of gone out of fashion now. A lot of young people aren't too keen on that.
But is it also part of the cultural issues we have in New Zealand that some of the young people expect what their parents currently own now? Is there a bit of that going on, or do you think at the end of the day this is more about the fact that it's just unaffordable? Yes, there are houses in Christchurch now, but whether they're actually affordable enough is the question, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And eventually it may improve. I mean, occasionally you have Hugh Pavletich here, and I don't agree entirely with what Hugh says all the time, but in essence he's right. You have to kind of almost flood the market with land to make it cheaper. And even if that land is made available on the outskirts of the city, although it might seem a little bit perverse, it will eventually have a flow-on effect to everywhere throughout the city, including the
that's right.
city.
I mean, he bangs on about opening up the fringe lands of Christchurch, and that will evidently mean lower house prices. But the council doesn't want that. They don't seem to be into that. If they did, you wouldn't see people going to Waimak or Selwyn, though, would you? They haven't tried to actually stop their rating base from going elsewhere. Should they have done that? Should they have tried to keep it?
It's an ideological issue that has vexed this town for years and years and years. The reason that we have Pegasus Town is that a planner at Environment Canterbury back in the day vehemently opposed the Preston's development. There are 2 or 3 times that people tried to get developments going at Preston's, which, when you think about it, is a much better place than Pegasus Town. But Pegasus Town is in a different jurisdiction. It's in Waimak District.
That's right.
They were quite keen to encourage development. So when these developers saw a farm for sale, they snapped it up and they've created Pegasus Town, and we now have another dormitory town out that way. Well, perhaps if they had, let things go a little bit at Preston's or some of the places that are closer to town, we wouldn't have that kind of problem.
I'm going to let you be mayor for 30 seconds. If you could encourage more housing in Christchurch, where would it be? Would you be open to opening up more land? Would you tell the government something about the land prices in Central City? Would you be trying to encourage people with sort of Sarah campaigns, the livable city? What would you do?
I'd do all of those things, really, Chris. I'd try and encourage the government to release that land more cheaply in the city in some way, perhaps by just creating an almost traditional subdivision, maybe not large sections, but smaller sections perhaps, and just get people in there living. I'd have a look at some of the reserves that we've got. There are a lot of reserves around now, especially with the red zone. That's the biggest reserve of the lot. And there'll be a lot of red zone land which is quite suitable for building on, because as we know, they were zone-wide decisions. They weren't necessarily every house or every section was kaput.
That's a good point you make. I do wonder what is going to happen to that red zone land, particularly on the east, because some are suggesting some of the land's okay, but they had to make decisions, as you say, widespread decisions. But that's going to cause, will that cause much fracas, do you think, when the government comes back and says we can now allow such and such to develop here?
Well, it'll be passage of time, won't it? Because there will be some people that'll be really hacked off if next year, they saw their property being sold at some kind of profit. Just
finally, you heard my glowing opinion piece at the top of that program. I do sincerely believe we're still going to be kind of optimistic in this city. Maybe it's for my own mental health, because you always being about the negative stuff in the city. Me personally, it's on talkback, it's easy to do. Do you see a bit of progress though, Chris Hutching? When I talk about things like the QE2,
sure.
the crossing, I know it's been a bit contentious with the Carters, but is there a sense though, I feel there's a sense 2015, there's better signals that the city's recovering. I'm seeing a lot more cranes around town. You can't deny that, can you?
Oh, absolutely. And look, over the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of changes, a lot of development. And I think that for a lot of us, though, our happiness is not always predicated upon a lot of those things. We still keep doing things. We go and meet friends. We do our hobbies and all those sorts of things that Christchurch has got to offer.
So you see, I get excited when I see a building popping up.
Yeah, well, it is exciting, and it's great to go into town to some of these new places, these new bars and whatnot.
Well, I wouldn't know.
No,
go out to the bars.
On the wagon.
No, off the wagon, thank you. Chris Hutching, thanks for your time tonight. Still off the drinking, thank you. 5 months. Well, to get in contact with us here at CTV, always keen for your feedback. Head to my Facebook page, facebook.com/LynchedInNZ. The Twitter handle is Lynch on ZB. You're on Twitter, Chris?
Yeah, I don't use it that much, Chris, I have to say.
It's vitriolic, that's for sure. And Chris at newstalkzb.co.nz if you'd like to comment on today's program. Well, I think the Mayor's back from China, so we'll catch up with her tomorrow. But from me and all the CTV team, have a good night.